Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, wonderful. Good morning, everybody. You are at the UMass Extension webinar on organics and food safety. I'm Lisa McKeag. I'm an educator with the UMass Extension agriculture programs, and I have a specialty in produce safety. Yeah, thanks for coming to this is the final webinar in our transition to organic partnership program series. These were done in collaboration with NOFA, Massachusetts, through a grant from USDA. I am not an expert in the NOP standards or necessarily an organic certification, but know enough to go through this. And I also think that Laura Davis, I'm not sure if you're here. Oh, there you are. I see you now, Laura, is on the call today, and she can help answer questions about some of those things as they arise if I'm not able to. Hi, Laura. And Laura, if you need to drop off for any reason, we can also collect past questions and sort of pass those along to you for follow-up if need be. I know you mentioned that you have another meeting, so feel free to drop off and we'll send those things to you if that is preferable for you. Okay, I will also note, I don't know how many of you read the original event description, but this was originally planned to be like a half-day workshop in person, and given the realities of life, I think most people who registered opted for the remote option that we had offered. And it was just harder to think about doing, the kind of hands-on stuff and eating lunch and stuff that we were going to do in person. So we switched it to be kind of a shorter webinar, so I won't necessarily cover everything that I was going to talk about in the, that was mentioned in the event description in super great detail, but I do hope to create kind of a foundation here about these two concepts together. And then we can answer more specific questions as they come up. I think people had sundry questions from different angles, so it was hard to kind of capture all that in one presentation, but we will definitely answer your questions to the best of our ability. Okay. I also want to acknowledge a former colleague of mine, Leah Cook, who was I think she's now a full-time organic farmer in Maine, but used to work for the Maine Department of Agriculture as a produce safety inspector. And the presentation that you're about to see is quite different than she's presented on produce safety and organic agriculture in the past. And I kind of borrowed the format from a presentation that she gave, although I've changed it from hers quite a bit. But there is a link to her original presentation here if you're interested in that. And I just wanted to give a thanks to Leah for letting me borrow some of the framework for this talk. Okay, so just want to start with this idea of and these are Leah's words here, the meeting on common ground. So just this idea that our farms are these fertile places, and we cultivate crops and we cultivate other things, hopefully healthy things for ourselves and our environment. And we're just going to talk about where the kind of use of these practices intersects on produce farms. So I'm going to talk first about the okay. Talk first about these two kind of related but different topics of organic produce production, which we're talking about as defined by the United States Department of Agriculture's National Organic Program, and then produce safety, which we'll talk about as it's regulated under the Food Safety Modernization Act from the FDA, specifically the produce rule. So organic agriculture and produce safety are these two kind of broad concepts that I'm going to focus on. I'm going to talk about within the scope of these two regulatory schemes. So one scheme, the NOP, the National Organic Program, is a voluntary program. It's focused on sustainability, environmental resources. It's regulatory in that if a producer chooses to describe their products as organic, they must follow the standards that are described in the NOP and receive certification from an authorized certifier. I know from the registration that a lot of you are not certified, but that you are using organic practices, but we're going to talk about the organic stuff within the context of the NOP. So I think those are largely the standards that you're probably following for the most part, regardless of your certification status. And then the other scheme is the FSMA produce safety rule. So this is a law, and this one must be followed by any commercial farm if that farm hasn't demonstrated their eligibility for some exemption. There are some exemptions in there, and many of you might be small farms that do qualify for an exemption. But I want to frame this in terms of the idea that FSMA produce safety rule is a law, and basically anyone selling produce has to abide by it. So with that, you don't get a certificate. You just have to comply with the standards that are described in the rule, and you're subject to inspection to determine whether you're in compliance. Again, if you haven't qualified for some exemptions. I will note that both the NOP and the FSMA standards are relevant for food products beyond fresh produce, so processed and packaged food for both things, and livestock for the National Organic Program and dairy. But today's discussion will focus on just farming fresh produce. So if you're interested in those other things, we won't really get into them. We're really focused on fresh produce here. And the goal today is really to think about how these programs interact, to understand the differences between what each program is trying to achieve and kind of what it means for you practically as an organic producer or someone seeking to transition to certified organic, who's trying to comply also with the produce safety standards. Okay, so this is our outline for the day. We're going to talk a little bit more about the rules themselves and sort of the details of them and just the principles behind them. I won't spend too much time on the details of them, but just a briefer introduction between sort of the principles and some of the stipulations and the regulations. Then we'll talk about what contamination means, and we'll go through some of the overlaps and tensions between the two programs and then summarize and share some resources. And there should be plenty of time at the end for discussion. We captured some of your questions at registration, and some of them might get addressed as we go along. And then I actually wrote down all the questions that you had, and we can address them in discussion at the end if we have time for that. And certainly feel free to ask questions as we go along. Okay, so what is the National Organic Program? National Organic Program is this structured program. That law that authorized it was passed in 1990s. It's been around for quite a while. And it sets these minimum standards for producers of organic products, for how they handle them, how they produce them, what kind of products or materials they can use in the production of those products. It does, if you're participating fully in the National Organic Program, require a third-party certification that says, someone will come to your farm your farm in this case, your production facility, more broadly, to go through the standards and make sure that you're in compliance with the regulations say the standards are. Optional to be organically certified. Growers don't have to participate in the organic program, but they are mandatory. The certificate, the inspection and following the standards are mandatory if you're using the term organic, like I said earlier. And I will note that there is a exemption so if there's producers on the call who sell less than $5,000 worth of produce, you can use the word organic without having to go through that inspection process. But everyone else, if you're using that word in your marketing of your products, you do need to follow the NOP standards and get certified. So what are the underlying principles behind the NOP? It's based on fundamentals of environmental sustainability and stewardship of resources. So it says specifically in the rule that it requires operations to use practices that cycle resources, conserve biodiversity, and preserve ecological balance. So that's kind of the underlying goal behind what the standards in the NOP say. It really is, a farm is certified based on the land that it's growing on. So you have certified organic land, and it's committed to the place, and it is interested in your crop rotations and sort of how you manage that land, and focused on site-specific solutions. Where in the world are you actually farming, and what kind of surrounds it, and what you're actually working with. And it emphasizes using cultural, biological, and mechanical practices for pest management and crop production, and focuses on using chemical solutions, even whether they're synthetic chemicals or even the allowed substances in organic production, focusing on using chemical solutions as a last resort. So really starting off with this focus on more integrated cultural practices. Importantly, there is a prohibited list. So there is it's a little bit more stringent, I would say, in terms of what it specifically allows and disallows from what we'll talk about in a second, the produce safety rule. There are prohibited substances, and there's a list of allowed substances that you can materials like fertilizers and pesticides and things that you can use on the farm in the production of your produce. And one of those things is also genetically engineered materials, so seeds or seedlings or other stock. Okay, so the FSMA produce safety rule, excuse me, that is part of so what's FSMA? FSMA is the Food Safety Modernization Act. It was a food safety law that passed in 2011 with some passed by Congress in 2011, and then different regulations were released around 2015. It is an amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is the big federal law that governs our food system in general, which that was created way back in 1938. And this is the first big change to that law since 1938. So it was kind of a big deal when it came out, and the idea behind it was, rather than the FDA who wrote the regulations for the produce safety rule, rather than relying on response to foodborne illness outbreaks, they were trying to create new rules to implement some preventive practices to incorporate into people's practice, to people's farming methods, to focus more on prevention, so that they still have the responsibility if something does happen, but the idea was to kind of reduce the number of foodborne illnesses that we might see coming out of the food system, in this case from fresh produce. It uses this called systems-based thinking, this use of risk assessments and recognition of hazards and thinking about how those hazards apply as risks on your farm. The rules, and I'm most familiar with the produce safety rule, but I'll say the rules are not that prescriptive. They're kind of adaptable to a wide range of businesses. So they basically are sort of this concept of you have to manage risk, and you have to kind of figure out what risks apply on your farm and kind of how you're going to manage them. It was implemented in 7 different parts. Like I said, it covers the rest of the food system, but we're focused. The part that affects produce farms is the produce safety rule. So that's really what I'll be talking about today. I might refer to it as the PSR, or the rule, or the produce safety rule. And the whole thing established as ostensibly, hopefully, science-based minimum standards for produce handling on farms. So the idea is that it's setting kind of a floor, a set of minimum standards that anyone producing produce for sale should be aware of and follow. And the idea behind them being science-based is, FDA looked at foodborne illness outbreaks and kind of used that information to say, well, these are the likely sources based on the research that we and others have done, to say, these are the likely sources of pathogen contamination on farms. So unlike the National Organic Program standards, which focus more on sort of environmental health, the produce safety rule is very specifically focused on consumer health. And human sort of what do you call it? Transmissible diseases, I guess. So it focuses on the idea that microbiological pathogens can make people sick, and more vulnerable people are sort of more likely to get sick, and anyone can from pathogens. And those pathogens that make people sick are most commonly found in animal and human feces. The microbes that tend to be pathogenic to human tend to be most happy in the human or animal guts. And so they're associated with feces. And so that's kind of what we're thinking about a lot of the time when we're thinking about these underlying food safety principles, is like, where is the poop or the things that live in the poop, and how do they get up potentially on the food? So they most commonly contaminate food via these things that may come in contact or themselves have poop. So people, but water can have feces contamination in it. And then food contact surfaces, anything that might touch, that someone might touch and that food might touch or an animal might touch. And then it also focuses on biological soil amendments. So we'll spend some time talking about that. Just a couple more things about them. They're both, they're administered by the U.S. government, potentially support of state agencies, and FDA has oversight over the FSMA produce safety rule. The USDA, which are these 2 big different government agencies that deal with food. USDA oversees the National Organic Program. And I said this already, but I'll just highlight that the PSR is mandatory. Some farms are eligible for an exemption based on their sales amounts or what crops they grow. There's a few crops that are kind of considered rarely consumed raw and a lower risk that fall kind of outside of the scope of the PSR. And then kind of depending on your markets, if you sell direct to consumer, you may qualify for some exemptions under the rule. And then the National Organic Program is voluntary, like I said, but again, some farms have to comply with it if you're using that term organic and selling more than $5,000 worth of produce. And important to remember as we go through is that the PSR outlines these best practices for managing produce for produce safety. So even if you're exempt, they still apply. The difference being that you might not be subject to inspection, but the expectation under that Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which the FSMA is a part of, is that if you're selling food, it should be safe and unadulterated. So you still have that legal requirement to sell safe food, and you may not have to, get an inspection under the PSR, but the general practices are a good idea for anyone of any scale to follow. And I put this up here because I keep talking about these things maybe as if they're two different things side by side. And I just want this sort of visual for how they interact to begin with. So like I said, the Food Safety Modernization Act encompasses the food system, and this umbrella is just capturing the produce parts of it right now for the most part. But well, not necessarily, but I'm talking about produce part. But underneath that umbrella is, your certified organic producers, your totally not organic producers, and people who are growing organically and not certified. I just wanted to sort of highlight that what I'm going to frame this conversation, the way that I'm going to frame it is within this umbrella of this law, the produce safety rule. How do you as an organic or certified organic producer meet those requirements of the produce safety rule? So the first thing they have in common is this idea of contamination. So both organic systems and this concept of food safety, they look to control contamination risks by, again, using this kind of systems thinking, this whole farm approach to looking at all your inputs and your product flow and management of people and animals and things around your farm, and look for potential sources of contamination and potential routes of contamination. So how's the pathogen or the contamination, I should say, getting onto the farm, and how might it get onto produce? And then once you kind of identify those things, you figure out these practices, these preventive measures that you might use to minimize those risks. So there's never, ever going to be a time in anyone's life where there's no risk in any way. But the idea behind this is to reduce the risk, particularly with respect to contamination in these two environments. So when we're talking about the organic program, the sources of the contaminants would be these prohibited substance things that the National Organic Program does not allow in an organic farm, and preventing how they get introduced onto produce. And like I said, that includes genetically engineered materials as well as mostly synthetic chemicals. There are some, we'll leave it at that, mostly synthetic chemicals like in pesticides and fertilizers. But when we're talking about the produce safety rule, really all we're focused on is human pathogens. So there are other things that would affect the safety of produce that are somewhat sort of mentioned in the rule, like chemical things and physical contaminants, glass or metal or something like that. But within the scope of the produce safety rule, it's certainly important to control those things. But what the PSR is really concerned about is this management of risk from human pathogens getting onto food. And managing that somehow. So bottom line between that is that whether you're trying to meet produce safety standards or you're trying to meet the organic program standards, what you're really trying to do is figure out where those sources of contamination are, develop those preventive practices to prevent contamination from any of these things. And I mentioned that there are, there's other forms of contamination, and people certainly in your questions and as people ask about this, when I do trainings and stuff on it, people definitely ask about pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides, and synthetic fertilizers. And by saying that I'm focused on human pathogens, I don't want to suggest that those kinds of contamination are not important. They're just not addressed by this rule. they are addressed by the government to some extent. So, contamination from other chemical sources when it comes to human safety are regulated under other laws, including the FIFRA, which is the law that what's the word I'm looking for? The law that relates to pesticides, and the CW, the Clean Water Act, which protects the integrity of our waters, hopefully. And those two things and different laws are overseen jointly by these different federal agencies. So when it comes to pesticides and things, the EPA registers those pesticides and kind of sets these what they hope are healthy, suitable tolerances for how much of that could be out in the environment and on produce. And the FDA does monitor pesticide residues and looks for their responsibility under that bigger, broader mandate, the FD&C, is to, look for and remove adulteration within the food marketplace. So they still have that responsibility when it comes to pesticides, because a pesticide that exceeds its tolerances would be considered an adulterant at that point. So FDA does monitor for that, but just not within the scope of the produce safety rule, and it's not what I'm gonna really be focused on today. We can talk about, if you do have questions about those things, they may come up in the scheme of trying to manage both your organic program and your food safety practices, but we can talk about that later during the discussion period. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the sort of overlaps and tensions between these two schemes, and put this here just to, I guess you all know what a farm looks like, but remind us of what some of those what we're talking about. So environmental factors, you're trying to grow safe food, but you're also trying to manage your environment. You're trying to keep good records and use soil amendments that you hope will contribute to environmental benefits, but you're also trying to create a product. And so inevitably there is some tension among these things. And I kind of broke this down, into these ideas of where there's, call them overlaps, but they're really places where the two schemes, I keep calling them schemes, that's what I'm going to call it from now, the NOP and the PSR, places where they kind of work well together, or at least there's no conflict. So if you're doing one thing, you can do the other thing without there being any real issue, and they may even support each other. Then there's some real parallels, the way that you're doing, some practices for one reason, and they may really work well together with some things that you're doing for another reason. And then there are a couple of tension points between organic practices and your food safety concerns. So those are the things we're going to cover in the next several slides. And I put this image up here again, just to remind us that I'm sort of focusing or framing this in terms of the produce safety rule requirements. So as an organic producer, how do you, given your growing practices, kind of work toward being in compliance with the produce safety rule requirements for making sure that whatever you're growing and however you're growing it, you're doing it without, by minimizing the risk of microbial contamination to that food. So there are the produce safety rule recognizes these kind of main sources for contamination, these 5 things: wildlife and domestic animals, your water quality, your people, the worker health and hygiene, and how people get trained. And then all the post-harvest handling and storage of your crops, so food contact surfaces and how things are handled post-harvest. And then soil amendments, including manure and compost. So kind of just walking through all those things, we'll just take a step by step and look at how the organic program looks at it, how the produce safety rule looks at it, and kind of how those things, how they interact. So the first one is wildlife and domestic animals, focusing mostly on the wildlife part of that to begin with. So surprisingly, maybe to you all, I put a overlap or doesn't disagree. So wildlife, the organic program explicitly recognizes as part of our natural resources, and the explicit goal, or one of the explicit goals of the organic program, is to maintain or improve natural resources. And that's basically what it says about wildlife. As far as the produce safety rule goes, it does say their domestic or wild animals can contaminate produce, and they definitely can. But I put it here as a doesn't necessarily disagree, because the goals of both programs is basically the same. So you have to, with with respect to wild animals on your farm, you definitely have to, and this is, it is, this isn't a big food safety training, and I would focus on this more if that's really what we were focused on. But you have to evaluate whether your produce can be harvested and identify produce that is likely to be contaminated, or you have, reasonable belief that it's contaminated by animals and not harvested. So that's a simple sentence and a big project to do that, to make sure that your produce hasn't and isn't likely to be contaminated by wildlife and domestic animals. But in terms of how these programs interact, the goal is kind of the same. You get to, there's wildlife in the environment, and importantly, this last bullet, this is directly from the produce safety rule. The regulation does not require farms to take measures to exclude animals from outdoor growing areas or to destroy animal habitat or otherwise clear farm borders around outdoor growing areas or drainages. This is what they would call kind of co-management of natural resources with your goals for produce safety. So it does say that if you have an inspector come to your farm, they will likely ask you how you exclude animals, and so there is some balance that you need to try to achieve here between both protecting the natural resources of your farm and protecting the produce from contamination. But the explicit goals of the programs are kind of the same, to recognize that sort of achieving ecological balance is an important goal for a farm, and just putting in practices that help to ensure that those natural resources aren't becoming a source of contamination. Hopefully that all makes sense. And then when it comes to domestic animals, this is actually, maybe even more surprisingly, I put it more as a parallel, where you may already be doing the things that the produce safety rule would expect you to do. So I'm not talking about domestic animals in terms of care or handling of livestock. That's kind of a whole other topic in terms of the well-being of those animals. But when it comes to livestock with respect to produce, what the National Organic Program states is that you can't let livestock contribute to contamination, of crops, soil, or water by all kinds of things, including pathogenic organisms. So within the National Organic Program, it is recognized that livestock has the potential to introduce contaminants onto a farm. And while it's very important in many cases to have that livestock on your farm, especially if that's what you're growing, you have to make some effort to make sure that they're not contributing to contamination, that you're preventing runoff of their waste into particularly waters, and that you're not, again, the idea is sort of achieving this natural balance, and you don't want that livestock to contribute to the contamination of those natural resources. So then when it comes to domestic animals and produce safety, again, domestic or wild animals can contaminate produce, but there isn't a prohibition. This is something I would hear from people when the produce safety rule first started coming out. It was like, do I have to get rid of all my animals? There's no prohibition on grazing or even working animals within the produce safety rule. But again, the big project is, how do you evaluate whether the produce that you're growing is likely to be contaminated by those animals? So again, that's a big topic and project to decide how to manage those animals on your farm. And there's a lot of stipulations involved in terms of training of people who are working with animals and working with produce that may be proximate to animals, that kind of stuff. But in terms of the goals of the programs, those things are not different. And very similar to what the organic program rule states, is that with the produce safety rule, you do have to take measures to prevent runoff from animals or animal manure from contaminating your produce, the food contact surfaces, or natural resources, including water. Okay, water. Similarly with the organic program, with the idea of livestock and animals, water is identified within the organic program as a natural resource. And again, you have to maintain or improve natural resources for your operation, and that includes soil and water quality. And the only thing that the organic program it doesn't really get into water as a source of contamination, because again, we're talking with the NOP, the contaminants are synthetic products for the most part. So with respect to water, what the NOP is concerned about is, again, the potential for the inputs that you might use on your farm to contaminate water with, again, those same things, like plant nutrients, pathogenic organisms, heavy metals, those kinds of things. So, or prohibited substances. So that's really all the NOP says about water. For the produce safety rule, water is a huge deal. A big part of the produce safety rule is focused on assessing water quality. Because they've identified water as an important potential source of pathogen contamination, either when you put it directly on your crop or just sort of the way water gets used in all your processes on your farm, and whether that's the water that you intentionally apply or the water that comes from the sky and helps materials run off around the farm. Water is a really potential important source of potential contamination. So there are a lot of standards within the PSR that talk about how you prevent, how you think about contamination of water quality. But when it comes to how the two programs interact between the NOP and the PSR, your goal with the produce safety rule is to prevent runoff that could potentially contaminate water into produce fields, or potentially contaminated water from getting onto produce, whether into fields or onto surfaces. So kind of that same idea that you're managing water in both cases as this important natural resources, but also recognizing that it is a potential source of contamination from human pathogens. Okay, worker health and hygiene and training is the next category within the produce safety rule that I'll cover. Really doesn't talk about it under the NOP at all. Just not addressed, but I have it here as they work well together. In terms of when you think about the produce safety rule, people are really, they're an important part of the produce safety rule. People are really a key source of human pathogens. We touch all kinds of things, and our hygiene is really important. Our health and our wellness, and not working around food when we're ill to avoid spreading contamination is a really important part of the produce safety rule, and therefore training about those things, about recognizing potential illness, signs of illness in humans, and exercising good hygiene around a farm is a really important part of the produce safety rule. And people working on farms have to be trained. There's like training stipulations within the PSR that say people who handle produce or food contact surfaces have to be trained appropriately for the duties they perform and in these kind of food safety concepts. So agrees with the organic program in that all of that is important and would also help. While the NOP regulations don't address it at all, certainly training workers to do their job appropriately and recognize sources of contamination from either pathogens or the other things you don't want on your farm is in good agreement, I would say, with what the organic program goals are. Okay, so all those things, maybe even surprisingly, were like relatively well overlapped, or even kind of agreed, worked well together, we'll say. The last part, or the thing that really I think creates the most potential tension, is the idea of soil amendments and the manure and compost in particular that you might be using. So let's get into that. So the organic program says a producer has to manage their crop nutrients and their soil fertility through these different things, rotations, again, cultural things like cover cropping, and the application of plant and animal materials. And for the most part, not allowed to use synthetic substances, this list of prohibited substances for their fertility. For the produce safety rule, the goal, again, is to control risks from biological soil amendments of animal origin. So that's where that tension is. In the one scheme, you are being, encouraged, if not mandated, to use animal-based materials. And in the other, you're being told that animal materials, animal-based produce or soil amendments create a increased risk for pathogen contamination. So there is some tension there. And the other difference between these things is that the organic program is explicit in that you're not allowed to use any sewage sludge or biosolids, even if they're certified under the federal regulations. The produce safety rule does allow for the use of sewage sludge if it conforms to those federal regulations for Class A biosolids. That's the 40 CFR 503. There's some contention about that, or other, not necessarily contention about it, but other concerns, I'd say, about it in terms of using biosolids and sludge that have come up recently that, again, are important, but outside of the scope of the PSR. So there might be things in those biosolids that are, biosolids are human waste, usually the byproduct of wastewater treatment. And they're the sort of nutrient-rich materials that would come out of a wastewater treatment plant, or in some cases, like a domestic septic type situation. And because that stuff is coming from humans, it might include all the things that humans put in their bodies, including, pharmaceuticals. And they might be exposed to metals or things like forever chemicals is a big topic of conversation now. Again, those things are important, but not addressed by the produce safety rule. So PSR does allow it, and there might be state-specific regulations about that, depending on what state you're in, but just wanted to make that clear, even though I don't know if that's necessarily a big issue for the folks on the call. But anyway, just pointing out those differences, that in one case you need to use plant and animal-based materials for the most part, and the other, there's this, you certainly can use animal-based materials, what PSR refers to as biological soil amendments of animal origin. But they recognize that those materials may present a higher risk for pathogen contamination. But maybe surprisingly, I've moved here to a nice parallel, which is that for the organic program, again, they're having to manage your crop nutrients and soil fertility through the application of plant and animal materials, but you also have to manage those materials in a way, like I said, with respect to wildlife and livestock, that doesn't contribute to contamination of crops, soil, or water. So you're already used to this idea that these materials are important, useful sources of fertility, but they also have some inherent risk to them when it comes to potential sources of contamination, more specifically pathogens. And that's the same idea with the produce safety rules. You want to think about what your inputs are and manage them to the appropriate degree of risk that they present. So produce safety rule doesn't get into at all what the requirements are about soil fertility or the condition of the soil, but it does want you to manage your inputs to prevent contamination of water sources or other things that might contaminate produce. And when it comes to raw manure, again, I have a nice parallel here, because this is something that the National Organic Program has already explicitly addressed, is that, when you're using animal-based amendments, if you're using raw animal manure, the rule states that it must be composted unless there is some interval of time between when you apply that to the soil and when you harvest a crop out of that same field. It says that you can, unless if it's not composted, you can apply it to a crop that's not intended for human consumption, which would be the same sort of idea for the produce safety rule as if you're putting it on some, pasture crop or something like that. That's one potential avenue if you're using raw animal manure. But importantly, what it says is that what the organic program says is that it needs you to incorporate raw manure into the soil not less than 120 days prior to the harvest of a product whose edible portion is likely to have contact with the soil, and then 90 days if the product is not likely to have direct contact with the soil. So there is this inherent recognition that there's some risk involved in raw animal manure that the National Organic Program has already set some standards to address. With the produce safety rule, it is very explicit that you can't apply raw manure directly to the harvestable portion of a crop. You can't side dress with raw manure. There aren't any explicit application intervals for raw manure, even though, as we've already recognized, we're talking about fecal material from animals that may contain human pathogens. But the produce safety rule, originally, and then when the produce safety rule came out, whenever that was, 2013, when they first put out a draft of it, they had wanted to put a 9-month application interval for the use of raw manure in fields where you're going to grow produce that's covered under the produce safety rule. And they got a lot of feedback about that. People were, it's meant to be a science-based standard, and they were saying, well, where's the science that supports an interval that's that long, and how is that practicable and stuff like that. So they took all that into consideration and released their final rule with no application intervals for raw manure, other than that you can't put it directly on a crop, with the sort of caveat that says that that section of the rule is reserved, and that FDA is currently pursuing research that would support a more science-based application interval that really takes into consideration the ability for pathogens or the tendency for pathogens in soil to die off over time, to be outcompeted by other organisms, How long do different pathogens persist? It really changed. There's a lot of research in terms of that. There's a lot we don't know about that because the persistence of different pathogens in soil will depend on the pathogen itself, the environmental conditions, the sort of climatic conditions where you're at. You know, the southeastern United States is quite different than the southwestern United States is different than the northeastern United States. So there's a lot of research that people are very actively pursuing to determine if there is a kind of broad application interval that would best lead to good produce safety outcomes, and that is still reserved. But in the meantime, what the sort of introduction to the produce safety rule says is not necessarily that the FDA tells you to use the 90-120 day interval that the NOP program uses, but that they won't take exception to it. And I think a lot of inspectors and auditors of food safety programs kind of rely on that number because it's good to have a metric with the idea that sort of the longer you wait, the greater the potential is that whatever pathogens in the soil started off that may have been in that raw manure may have died off over time. All make sense so far? Okay. And then for compost, again, I've got this down as a nice parallel. The organic program states, again, that animal and plant materials can be used and that they would include also composted. If you're, it said that raw animal manure, if you're going to use it, it can't be raw, it should be composted through a process. And it describes, I've lost my bolding here for some reason, but describes these scientifically validated processes that this is parts 2 and 3 here that say you have to maintain this minimum temperature of 131 to 170 degrees for 3 days. And that's for, if you're using a static pile, and if you have a turned pile, the same temperatures for 15 days. And you can use uncomposted materials that don't have animal-based materials in them. For the produce safety rule, I stole this directly, and I think actually there's some, I don't think that they, oops, sorry. The numbers are basically the same. Well, I copied the text directly, but I think there may be some little differences between the specific metrics. But the idea is that the produce safety rule borrowed kind of directly from what the organic program had in it in terms of turning raw manure into something that can be safely applied up to the day of harvest. So when you're using something that was properly composted within the produce safety rule, you can apply that, you can side dress that. There's a 0-day application interval for appropriately treated compost. And they identify these scientifically validated processes that are the same, basically, as what's in the organic program. And again, when you're using uncomposted plant materials, also okay for produce safety purposes, if you're using those already in your organic system. Okay, so that's all I have to say about soil amendments. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is records. So this is one place where there's some nice overlap and even some parallels where you may be already keeping basically the same record. So organic program, both of these things are where standards have been set for achieving the goals of each of these programs in order to best determine that you are meeting those goals, and having someone else in some cases come and either audit or inspect your farm to make sure that you're doing that. You got to write a lot of stuff down, unfortunately. So record keeping is a big part of both of these programs. For organic, you have to keep records about where you got your seeds and how they were produced, and how you said it's specific to your farm and your land. So how you, what you've applied to the field and what you've applied to your crops and what kinds of pesticides you've applied. And then of course your compost production records we just talked about, and that you have to meet those metrics and take temperature readings to make sure that you've achieved those goals that will kill. The idea behind those temperatures is that they're hot enough to kill pathogens. And then other things like your cleaning sanitation logs and things for that. So you can see here that there's nice overlap. So if you're already keeping compost production records for organic, your organic status, you also need to keep those for the produce safety rule, but you don't need to keep different records. So there are some nice places of overlap where if you're already doing it, and importantly, if you're already used to keeping records, you're already kind of used to having this kind of outlook on your farm about understanding the inputs that are coming in and the way that products are flowing and things are touching each other, especially if you're doing organic and using conventional materials side by side, on other parts of your farm, you're already used to kind of what it takes to keep those records and demonstrate that you qualify for this program. So to sort of meet produce safety standards, maybe you already have good systems in place, I guess, for implementing some of these new things that you maybe haven't thought about before, like your worker training records and thinking about your water quality. And the last thing I want to touch on here is this idea. I got back. This came up during the soil amendments and to some extent during talking about wildlife and domestic animals. But I feel like this is the sort of overarching tension point between these two ideas that people have about what it means to have an organic farm and what it means to practice good food safety practices. In organic systems, that there's this emphasis on promoting microbial life as part of a healthy ecosystem, particularly in soils, which is great. Most microbes, the vast majority of them are beneficial to neutral when it comes to humans. There's very few in the scheme of all the microbes that exist that are human pathogens. But those ones that are human pathogens are really important and can make people really sick. So the idea behind it is we focus on this promotion of microbial life in terms of good balance of it. I keep talking about like a balanced ecosystem, where food safety really focuses on minimizing and controlling the risks, again, of those pathogenic microbes. So this tension, again, comes from the idea that the conditions that you might be implementing, like increasing your organic matter, applying raw manure, that promote microbial life in the soil, can also potentially be conditions for the growth of pathogens. So again, this is where those tensions are a little bit, is that you're selecting tillage practices that maintain that help to maintain the biological productivity in the soil, and using animal-based materials and not using synthetic materials that would kill those microbes potentially, and using crop nutrients and stuff that is hopefully not leading to contamination, but is providing good food for microbes on your farm. Where the produce safety rule is happy about all of that, but is really concerned about the microbiological hazards that might be presented when you're doing that. So the idea being, again, that you want to prevent contamination with pathogens and addressing those sources of contamination. The good news about this, and this is maybe where I should have changed this from a tension point to maybe a parallel, is that there is some evidence that soils with high organic matter, there's good evidence that high organic matter correlates with greater bacterial diversity. But there is some evidence that greater bacterial diversity is also correlated with potentially decreased survivorship of some pathogens. E. coli 0157H7 is an example of an important foodborne pathogen. I'm highlighting here that this is in controlled studies, but there are studies that demonstrate, and there's lots of more research happening, like I said, related to the application of raw manure. This is the kind of thing that folks are studying, is what is the survivorship of these pathogens under different soil conditions? And can you amend the soil in a way that decreases that amount of time that you might have to wait for pathogens to be likely to kill off? So I don't have solid numbers about that, obviously, in this moment, but the idea being that enhancing microbial life within your soil and on your farm isn't necessarily in tension with produce safety goals. So I think people get afraid sometimes that food safety ideas mean like sterility, that you're sanitizing everything and all microbial life must die, and that isn't the goal. The idea really is, yes, do everything you can to enhance your soil organic matter and promote biodiversity, not just in your soil, but again, the PSR recognizes that, ripping out all of your hedgerows so that the animals don't have any places to live actually doesn't have beneficial food safety impacts, and in fact, may have negative consequences for food safety if you do that. So there's this recognition inherent in the produce safety rule that balance and diversity is a positive thing. And really what you're trying to do is target all of your sanitation and your hygiene activities to those likely sources and routes of pathogen contamination. So if you're handling raw manure, make sure that people are trained and that you have good standard operating procedures for, hand washing and cleaning of tools and equipment that contact those sort of more likely sources of pathogen contamination. Okay. So in summary, these things, the Produce Safety Rule from the Food Safety Modernization Act and the National Organic Program standards, set these kind of baseline rules for growers to follow if they're covered by those rules, and also provide good framework for growers who are not technically covered, but want to achieve the goals of these programs. The FSMA standards, like I said, they apply to all produce farms, with the focus really being on the prevention of microbial contamination and the reduction of the number of foodborne illnesses that occur in the United States. Everyone has to grow safe food. That's what, if you're selling food, it can't be adulterated. And this is sort of one aspect of that concept of adulteration, is reducing microbial contamination. But not every farm is going to be subject to a routine inspection. So that's kind of, I wanted to try, if you're not covered by the produce safety rule, my point in saying that is, don't forget about all these things that we've just said. You just may have to do sort of more of the management of whether or not you're complying with some of those principles a little bit more on your own without an inspection. But really what I want to drive home is that produce safety and organics, they are compatible. There's this concern with contamination. Both emphasize using kind of good sanitation, in some cases, buffers that might protect crops or food contact surfaces or your soil or your water resources from the contamination that is relevant to whichever scheme we're talking about. Both emphasize the protection and co-management of natural resources, and both really rely on good record keeping to ensure that those standards that you're trying to achieve are being met. And that biggest tension point, again, is with the use of animal-based soil amendments, because manure can contain fecal pathogens. So allowing an interval between application of manure and harvest of crops, and using the same composting processes for killing pathogens in animal materials is applicable to both things. And lastly, produce safety doesn't mean sterility. It's just really focusing on those sanitation of likely sources of pathogen contamination. And that really, for the produce safety rule, again, that's people, that's food contact surfaces, that's assessing the quality of your water, and figuring out how to have contact with animals or raw manure, either yourself or with your crops, in a way that recognizes the risk that's inherent there. And finally, soil microbial diversity may decrease persistence of human pathogens in soil. And the research is pending on the specifics about that, but I wanted to emphasize that is true. Okay. Any questions so far? I have a couple resources to share here. Along with Genevieve, actually do trainings and stuff on food safety. We have this website that has information about a lot of things I just talked about. So sections on water and worker health and post-harvest handling. If you just Google food safety, you can hit this link or type in this link, or if you just Google UMass food safety for farmers, you can get to this site. And then I also wanted to highlight our state partner, which is the Massachusetts Department of Ag Resources. I keep talking about FDA being the ones that are responsible for the food safety rule, for the produce safety rule. But it's actually implemented at the state level by the Department of Ag, and they have a produce safety program, and they're super helpful. If you have questions, there's their inspection program. I didn't get into this, but there is also an audit program. So the way that you opt into the NOP program, you can also opt in, even if you are technically exempt from the rule. You can opt into an audit program where you get more support. You do get a certificate. It's a little bit more hands-on, but there is the same again with organic. There may be some market benefit to having that organic seal. You would similarly get this Commonwealth Quality Seal, abbreviated as CQP. They talk about the CQP program, and that also maybe confers some market advantage. There are some buyers that would say, you say, well, I do all the things for FSMA, and they might say, well, how do I know? And we want to see a food safety certificate. So you wouldn't get a certificate, like I said, for just following the law, but if you participate actively in this program, you would get a certificate. So if you have questions about that, you can certainly reach out to MDAR. Just a couple other food safety things. These are two places to get good information about like the current rules, and there's also a lot of training materials and best practices between these two things. The Produce Safety Alliance created a standardized curriculum for produce safety that I know some of you on the call have taken, either with me or others. And it's like a full day thing that kind of covers all the basics of those things that I just talked about in more detail. And you can get newsletter releases from them that will give you updates about the rules. And then the Northeast Center to Advance Food Safety, or NACAFS, is also a really great, it's an extension, it's based at UVM, and tons and tons of great resources for managing produce safety on the farm. Here's some organic resources in case you are interested in that. The NOFA Mass website, and then some other ones. MOFGA's the Organic Gardening Association in Maine, some other sources, Rodale, Organic Farming Research Foundation, and NSAC. And last, I wanted to point out, and Jamie, are you on the call? This last resource I'm excited about. There's a team of people led here by Dr. Patrick Bauer, and then Patrick's postdoc Jamie is on the call here, and they're working on a project to, as you can see, develop food safety tools and training for organic produce farms. And I'm excited about it. And I just wanted to give Jamie a chance to introduce the project if you wanted to, and just say what kinds of things you're working on.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having me, and thank you for this plugin for our project. So we had a planning grant at one point in time, and we talked to producers and we tried to identify what those tension points, and you highlighted it very well through this course. And we found that one of the main tension points is that like biological soil amendment piece. So we took what we learned from the planning grant and we applied for another grant through the USDA OREI program, which is the Organic Research and Extension Program initiative. And now we have kind of moved on to help kind of people get over that tension point, those kind of barriers to food safety and organic certification, like co-management, I guess you would say. So our key deliverables for this project are to provide technical assistance through a soil amendment risk assessment tool. We are at like year 0.5 of a 4-year project. So we are still in the process of kind of going through the literature and identifying what potential parameters and data sources that we have available to us, which means that we are not quite sure what that tool will entail yet. We like to think of it as, you know, a Cadillac versus a scooter thing. We're hoping that we have enough data, because this is a science-based tool, that we have enough data to, you know, build this like prime Cadillac that is like customizable for different regions and places and the diversity of organic that is out there. But we might only have enough data for a scooter. But but we'll see where that goes. But we're still in the kind of development process for that tool, and we are happy to take feedback on that so that we have a better idea of what direction is beneficial for those people that we ultimately think will be end users, which can be, you know, anybody working in or around organic. And then the other thing that we plan on doing is also establishing a training program, probably similar to this one, but focus on that tool that we developed, but also kind of like wider conversations about the tensions, parallels, and overlaps, maybe, of complying with both the food safety and organic, that we learned through the process of doing interviews and listening sessions and surveys and stuff like that through this project. So again, this is the beginning. That training, those training and outreach materials won't be available for 2 or 3 years from now, but we do plan on doing some in-person workshops eventually. And again, we're trying to be stakeholder informed about this. So if anybody seems to think that there's a lot of interest in their area, please let us know.
Great. And I'm happy to share your contact information with anybody that's on the call here that's interested in that. And if you want to reach out and give your feedback about what you'd like to see. And of course, I'll be happy to share among our broader group of stakeholders, our newsletter readers and stuff like that, any sort of materials that you come up with that would be appropriate to share. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and for sharing that information about the project.
Thank you.
What else do I have here? That's it. And then there is plenty of time for discussion if people have questions. I do have, I know that people sent in questions ahead of time, and some of these I shared with you ahead of time, Laura, that might be easier for you to answer than me that have to do more with organic, but I guess John, maybe you can tell me if there's questions to answer now and we can address those, and then we can get to the ones that that people sent in.
Yeah, give folks a minute, and if you have a question, put it in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and just speak up.
Cool. Seeing none, I will go ahead and move ahead. These were copied directly out of the black is the actual question that we received, some of which I just received like this morning, so I haven't had time to think about them, but someone had written in saying that one of the things they were interested in was food safety on a minimal budget or minimal sort of infrastructure resources. There's a really good question, and I kind of wrote down some general thoughts here. And as I mentioned earlier, the produce safety rule is not that prescriptive in terms of, you don't have to, you're not required to buy all kinds of new stuff. You don't need to have all stainless steel tables or a brand new, wash pack facility. That might be nice for other reasons, including food safety, but there's some just sort of general principles that using what we just talked about, this idea that what you're trying to do is manage the potential for pathogens, which largely come from human and animal feces, from getting onto a farm, getting into a piece of produce or a surface that produce touches. You're really focusing on these kind of good housekeeping practices. So good sanitation, good organization, streamlining of your work and your product flow. Of course, easier to clean equipment, equipment that's in good repair, that kind of thing is going to help you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to buy the newest piece of equipment or the best thing. It just means that, all the way down to simple sort of, Rubbermaid totes and that kind of stuff, relatively easily cleanable. And so that's the kind of thing you're focusing on. It's like, and I will recommend now, the next time we do a produce safety, we do, like I said, Genevieve and I, along with our colleagues at MDR, do these produce safety trainings that I mentioned, these kind of all-day trainings that go through some of this stuff in more detail. So if you are interested in that, we will share information. You can tell me that you're interested, and I'll add you to my interested in a training list, and I'll reach out to you directly if something is scheduled. Or you can just pay attention to our Veg Notes newsletter, where maybe you heard about this webinar to begin with. And then the other things around sort of focusing on food safety is really nailing down, employee training and having good standard operating procedures for how you manage all kinds of practices on your farm, but particularly with respect to these areas where pathogen contamination is most likely. So handling water, handling raw manure, that kind of thing. And then finally, if you're in Massachusetts, I don't know if everyone here is, there might be some folks from out of state, but Massachusetts does have grant funds available that can help you make some of these improvements that are harder to make without some support. So I have AFSIP, that's the Agricultural Food Safety Improvement Program grant. And you can, again, Google that and you will find the, is it open now? Do you remember, Olivia, if it's open? I can't remember.
The food safety grant is open, and I think the deadline is mid-May, maybe, or the end of May.
So you do have a little time if you want to apply for some things. And that grant covers all kinds of stuff from, again, like new harvest bins to packing tables to all kinds of stuff, really. So you can reach out to them too if you want some more parameters about what you can apply for, but that's really helpful. And it really does help, particularly if it helps anyone, but everyone has sort of minimal budget when it comes right down to it. And that's helpful. So that was my answer to that question. The next question someone wrote, and I think this is what they were kind of hoping to get out of this talk, and I don't know if that we were successful in that, but this idea of what are the ways organic fruit and veg production can inhibit produce safety, and what are the ways it benefits produce safety. And so kind of tried to talk about that in terms of there being this idea that like creating balance within your, generally on the farm and among like of natural resources is beneficial potentially to produce safety. The exact degree to which it might be beneficial in different circumstances is kind of still a matter of research, like I said, but I guess that one I would like to kind of throw out there. And Laura, if you have thoughts about this, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I've never really thought about organic certified fruit and veg production as inhibiting produce safety. Certainly I think food can be contaminated whether you're organic or not, based upon some of the issues that you've outlined here in regards to human or animal feces contamination. So I do think that, when we talk about microbes, there's still a lot of research to be done about microbes and how they work and how they make our gardens more productive based upon nutrient cycling, and tend to overtake some of the bad pathogens, but that science is still being outlined and looked at. But I can't necessarily think of an individual instance where being organic would inhibit your product safety, especially if you're following all of the rules. I think that FSMA has been incorporated quite successfully in a lot of organic farms. So even the largest farms who had to, comply very early on have found a way to be compliant as well as be certified.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Yeah, and this one just came in 2 minutes before I logged onto this call, but someone's interested in the best practices for record keeping and the water management requirements. And yeah, we didn't cover that necessarily, but in terms of water management, like I said earlier, the NOP doesn't so much get into water one way or the other, other than that you can't contaminate it with anything. But I certainly can talk with whoever's interested in the specific water management requirements of the produce safety rule, which I didn't get into here. It's kind of a, well, anyway, it's a big topic. And then best practices for record keeping. This is kind of what Jamie was talking about too, is that maybe I think this might be within your camp of like things that you might be working on with that, with your project. But I don't know, maybe Laura, of some good templates for these kinds of things where, I showed that slide about which program needs which records. And so maybe hopefully not too complicated to kind of integrate those things into a unified farm plan that incorporates both your organic processes and your food safety concerns. So
the PSA does have a template, and they do have advice for a food plan, like a food safety plan.
Yeah, that's true. There are lots and lots of templates out there for food safety plans that don't get into organic one way or the other, but certainly there are lots of templates out there for records. And in terms of the overlap between your organic records and your food safety records, I don't have a good template that sort of considers both of those things necessarily, but there are lots of templates out there for you to kind of strategically employ on your farm.
Yeah, so I had written in the chat earlier that if you do certify organic, the very first year, you do need to do water testing for any water sources that are not municipal. Those would be coliform E. coli tests that you would need to submit at your first application for organic certification. And so actually the certifier does make recommendations if they come back to contain coliform for the farm. So that's kind of the main area in crops production that they get involved with water management. Of course, on the processing side, they get more heavily involved with, sanitizers and the types that you need to use versus conventional processing. There are a lot of records to be kept for organic certification, not unlike most good business practice type records, but if anybody has any specific requests about that, there are some really good SARE documents on organic records templates. And there's records suggested for keeping your compost, just a one-page type of record that can help you identify which records to keep. And so if anybody needs those, just reach out to me as well, Laura Davis at nofamass.org.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I just finally opened the chat and saw that you have a hard stop at 11 and you're still here, and I'm so grateful. But obviously if you need to go, feel free, but I am happy that you're still here. I do have some other, I'm going to click through, there's just a couple more slides here where people did ask questions that are that I had some thoughts about and put them down here, but I thought I put them here. So one person asked, how would I know if adjacent properties are polluting my soil via air drift or water runoff? I italicized this idea of pollution and contamination in these questions, just since that's what we talked about. These things have in common, although we're talking about different contaminants to some extent. So my first question here with the person who asked this was, what kind of, to start with, what kind of contaminant are you concerned about? And, there's communication with your neighbors and if you have specific evidence of contamination. I mean, sometimes, we do deal with things where people are growing organically and there's evidence on their crops that a prohibited herbicide is having an effect on, some things, sometimes the damage is really clear, or at least evident that something's going on, and other times it's much less clear. And so it's a complicated answer and really case by case, I would say. And then you may need to elicit the help of, your state agriculture agency and or extension, and NOFA, I'd say too. And Laura, have you dealt with this in the past? People having to deal with?
Yeah, when people are originally trying to certify a particular field, we do look at the width of the buffer and whether there's any neighbor who might be spraying, whether it be a farm or a resident, and whether or not that buffer is big enough. I mean, they don't tell you how wide the buffer has to be, but examination and inspection of the property and what's happening there is important to be able to prevent this sort of thing.
Yeah. Wonderful. And yeah, that's the next question was, what are some ways to limit pesticide and herbicide contamination from neighboring properties? And as Laura alluded to, that is specifically addressed in the NOP under this land requirements, that you should have these distinct defined boundaries and buffer zones. And as you just said, Laura, there's sometimes where, you have to do some, I think, thinking to determine how big those boundaries are and what the risks are, what you're adjacent to, and thinking through what an appropriate size or even what kind of boundary or buffer. You might have a vegetative buffer, you might have a hedgerow, you might have different kinds of things that could help to prevent that kind of contamination.
And the organic farm, once they're certified, is enabled to utilize the mapping for aerial spraying for the state, so that they are excluded. And also for those towns participating in truck spraying for mosquitoes or other insects, they can exclude themselves from those sprayings too. But it's a little bit more nuanced when you're working with a neighbor.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you for that. And then this is just a sort of sundry, I don't know how to answer them questions that, again, I appreciate you still being here, and apologies for keeping you, but these are more in your camp.
Yeah. So the first question is, obviously, I think it's very worth getting certified. I do have a certified organic 2.5 acre intensive vegetable farm, especially if you're brand new. because customers will have immediate confidence in your practices if you're showing that organic seal. There's a lot of other reasons why it's worth to get certified, but probably not time to go into them now. What sorts of requirements are needed to sell organically at a public farmers market? As Lisa's already mentioned previously, if you are using the word organic in any of your marketing, no matter where you're selling the product, you need to be certified. This is not just a small thing. Strengthening rules of enforcement, which went into effect on March 19th of this of this year, actually is looking at farms who are marketing themselves as growing organically but are not certified, and are placing fines on them of $10,000, even as a small farm. And they are telling them that if they don't certify, that they will have that fine. And so it's not something to mess around with at all anymore. This is evident that this is happening in our neighborhoods, in our farms. So make sure that you are certified if you are selling or saying the word organic. And then I think that was I would love to learn more about using, I'm going to skip the wheat or geese. Using no-till practices on organic, how does this affect soil amendments and IPM? Many small scale farms are no-till and certified organic. Mine is as well. So happy to answer, any additional questions there. Amendments just don't get tilled in, or maybe they're only mixed into the top 2 inches. And we work IPM the same way, whereby, we're doing scouting and deciding how many bugs is the right amount per plant before we utilize a pesticide. And we have to do that in order to utilize any restricted type of pesticides too. But we do have, I know there's a no-till networking event coming up in Haverhill I think it's May 19th. And that might be a good way. She's a certified farm. So that's at Late Bloom Farm in Haverhill. So you can check that out on the NOFA website.
Thanks, Laura. And I should say that in terms of using IPM and pest management on farms, that's also something that our extension programs can help out with too. If you go to UMass Extension Vegetable Program, again, you maybe already get information about this through our Vegetable Notes newsletter if you subscribe to that. But if you go to our website, UMass Extension Vegetable Program, there is information on there too. You can contact us, you can ask us a question, you can request a farm visit, and we can also help with integrated pest management for organic farms. And we do know, it certainly Laura is a good resource, and that sounds like a good program. And we have a soil health specialist here who also could maybe help sort of thinking through some of these no-till questions. And so there resources abound. It's not necessarily, it's a more long-term answer, I guess. And then I don't know, I guess I should address the weeder geese. I'm assuming that you mean you're buying geese. You just say you're buying geese to help with weeding. And it would be some of the same considerations, I guess, that we talked about, that like geese are animals that potentially could transmit pathogens in their poop. From a food safety perspective, it would be a matter of managing that fecal matter to make sure it's not a source of contamination to your potentially harvested crops. But from an organic perspective, I don't really know. It's an animal-based amendment. I don't know if that helps to answer the question. And
hey, Lisa and Laura, there was one question further up that we missed. I'm just wondering if either of you know the source of the 91-20 rule in NLP, how that came about.
It's a good question. I've wondered that too, and Laura, maybe yeah.
I do not know the answer to that question. I was interested in hearing about the FSMA research that they're doing to finally sort of include that as an official rule for FSMA.
Yeah, I've been looking for updates about that. I went to years ago, there was a soil summit that the Produce Safety Alliance, who's interested in these questions, put together, and brought all kinds of researchers, including those from the FDA and various people together. And at the time they said, we're doing a lot of research, and I've been trying to find updates on, I mean, you can look through the published research and find related things through just, you know, searches, but I haven't heard anything from either FDA or the Produce Safety Alliance, which would be their kind of educational partner about some of this stuff about it. All just to say, it's kind of complicated. My understanding is that the 9120, well, I'm not gonna make any assumptions about it. I don't know what the original provenance of that was, other than to say that some interval was anticipated to be helpful in reducing the amount of pathogens that are likely there. And I don't know where those numbers came from. I'm not sure. But as new research is published, that's relevant, and it certainly, as information comes out of FDA about rules around that, I will make sure to get the word out to as many people as I can. I think that's it.
Yeah, nothing else in the chat.
I did see that you guys answered some questions in the chat, and that is very helpful. Thank you. We will review it in case there's anything lingering, or if I don't know what we've been doing at the end of this. Are you sending any resources out to people, or?
We certainly can. In some cases we did. This meeting is being recorded, so I'll send the link to the recording out in the next few hours. And so if there's any resources, Lisa, that you think would be helpful to send out, we can include them in that email. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here, and don't hesitate to reach out again. You have, I'm sure, various of our contact information now through signing up for this webinar and through the chat and stuff. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have additional questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.